Hello, Josh. I mean, you're a
Hey,
little
Josh.
He always has the
There is a
most.
bit of fur there.
You always have the most impeccable hair. I swear I've said this a few times, but it will just keep coming back to me. It's just so good.
You only see me on good days. That's the thing. You don't see what happens when there's not a camera on or I'm not in public. So
I see how it is. I get it. Okay. Now it makes sense. So Josh is going to be talking to us today about something slightly less positive. No, it'll be positive in the end. I always like Josh's talks, especially when he includes things like the OODA loop and all those kind of things. But yeah, we will hand it over to you, Josh, and let you get started.
awesome. Thank you. All right. So over the next half hour, I'm going to talk through why security initiatives are doomed to fail and what you can do about it. I think I'm not going to talk about how to do security, is how to get security done at kind of bigger business scale. Like I work with enterprises mostly and that kind of stuff. If you're like a small startup of 5 people, these are problems you shouldn't have for quite a while. But as soon as you get to any kind of realistic size, what I'm going to talk about today starts to become quite problematic for you. So there's kind of 3 key takeaways for today. The first is understanding how workflows is fundamental. The second is you need to be constrained to it, and I'm going to get maybe over specific on the definition of constraint, but I won't be able to help myself, and it's kind of important. And the third one is agile doesn't scale across teams, which seems to be a very common key takeaway from my talks. A whole variety of them have that point right up front and center. But this is a talk. Normally I just bash agile, scaling agile, and this time I'm actually going to try and provide a little bit of an answer to it as well, which is slightly better than me just bashing it, which is the normal kind of bit that I do. And there's a few principles that underlie this talk. The first one is developers are both the cause of and the solution to all problems. Obviously, slight asterisk, little bit of hyperbole here, but effectively getting developers to do the right things or making it so they don't have to do anything at all is kind of crucial. And I think when I looked at the schedule, I feel like I'm kind of preaching to the choir and also kind of repeating at a high level what other people are saying. I imagine what I'm going to talk about today is slightly different and a little bit more of a structured approach to talking about this and management systems you can use to actually try and do this. The second principle is security is about influence, not execution in here. Realistically, the security posture of a company, and this kind of stems from the first principle, is it's not about the work that the security team is doing in and of itself. It's about influencing what the rest of the business does. And that's kind of the important bit. A little bit, and I'll keep this brief, about myself. So I'm Josh Armitage. I wrote a book with O'Reilly on cloud native security a few years ago. I'm the cloud practice lead for Asia Pacific and Japan for Cognizant, which just happens to include security under it as well. It is kind of a dumping ground for many, many things. I've been working in like enterprise consulting for far too long. I read a lot of books. I've done a lot of stuff on cloud. And for my sins, I've also spent time working on mainframes, machine learning in a pre-Gen AI era. And I generally like to run my mouth a lot. And I also run Beer Ops here in Perth. If you're not familiar with Beer Ops, I'll just do a very quick plug. It is a free for attendee twice yearly meetup that happens in Perth, Sydney, Melbourne, and Brisbane. They're pretty awesome. Melbourne's about 1,000 people. Perth is about 400. Sydney's about 1,000 as well. But it's just get everyone together, everyone have a nice time and meet up. Kind of similar vibes to ComfyCon in some ways from there. Apart from, we talk more about alcohol than chicken. But, it is what it is. Being from Perth, I'm going to use a fictitious company that I always use called Quokka Incorporated. And although the company is not real, the pain, which you might see in my eyes as I talk, is very much real. They're trying to digitally transform. They're doing agile, very much in inverted commas. And realistically, security is working harder than ever here. This isn't about, there's no fault on effort in what I'm going to talk about today. And I think that's very important. It's not that people aren't trying hard enough, and the common kind of enterprise response to things is get people working harder. this is kind of trying to be a counter to that. I'm not a massive fan of hustle culture in general. I think this is, oftentimes the amount of waste in what you're doing is so high that working harder is just the worst thing you could possibly do. And realistically, in my experience, hitting keyboards or people can only get you so far when you're trying to get security to happen at scale. One of the things that I see very commonly at enterprise scale is this concept of kind of dual speed IT. And, I'm going to talk, mainframe on one side, Kubernetes on the other. Technology is not specific here, but really this is an average day in the life of a security person who has everyone trying to go full cloud, trying to use containers, maybe serverless, trying to go off into the distance. And at the other side, you've got the mainframe devs who are looking at, well, this is the change we want to get through this quarter. And it's just such a diametrically opposed, juxtapositioned piece there that it gets really, really hard to manage. And I imagine I'm slightly preaching to the choir with this one. And really, another one of the things I see far too often is people say people process tools a lot. It really doesn't stop people trying to tool their way out of a people problem. And to get a slight bit more specific, the story I'm going to talk about is around cloud security posture management, just because it's a very common one, and I've yet to see it done well anywhere I've gone. It's always problematic when they do this, because they kind of think we have the tool. We've paid insert security vendor here a lot of money and things are better now, right? And realistically, they're often not. So just to put this in kind of terms of context, so like a CSPM tool, enterprise scale, order of magnitude about $1 million a year kind of territory you're paying. So it's a fair chunk of cash you're actually throwing into these things. And this is quite a common model that I've seen where security gets the budget to pay for said tool for the first year. And they're like, well, after that, we'll have proven the value. Everyone's going to be happy to pay for this. Realistically, I've yet to see anyone happy to pay for it. And they're not necessarily opposed to it theoretically, but they're asking like, well, what did I get out of it? What value did it drive for me over the last year that now I'm willing to foot like 10 to 20% of the bill for this thing? And you'll see things like this happen with the kind of number of controls. So you'll see like the amount of controls the CSPM is looking for. They're going up every month. That's good, right? We're getting more visibility into what's going on. But what you'll see in the counteracting point is the number of violations increase every month at a faster rate than you're adding controls. And the average age of the violations is increasing. So realistically, when you look at this from a security posture perspective, things are actually just getting worse. You have a bit more visibility, but something's not happening on the other side of this, right? So security posture is eroding over time, and we're finding problems faster than we can fix them. And generally, you default into this reactive over proactive approach. So it's more like, oh my God, new critical thing was found. We'll go start smacking people to go get it fixed because it's important. But realistically, security is often just chasing their tails on this. And again, it's not from them not wanting to be better, but potentially, and I'm going to make the case that it's down to a misunderstanding about how things actually work, how work gets done, how knowledge work actually functions, and what we can do about it from there. So the first of the key things we're talking about, you need to know how work flows. So let's dive into that a little bit more. So value streams. If you're unfamiliar with the concept, this is kind of like the quickest, dirtiest definition. They're from pleased to thank you. So from idea to in the hands of the customer is a value stream. Effectively, you've got all the steps that go along there. They can be owned by one team, and a team can own a value stream end to end, or you can split value streams across multiple teams in there. There are generally reasons why you want to go one team, but it's not always the case. And when you look at value streams, there are a variety of metrics that come through. I'm going to talk about kind of the two key ones today, which is throughput, which is the amount of units delivered per unit time. So this can be 1.6 stories a day. It can be, and I'm going to go bash story points later, but it can be 80 points a sprint or something like that. But it's how much are you getting done for a particular unit time, and the lead time is the time for a unit to be delivered. So from entering the value stream, how long till it's in the hands of a customer from here. The other metric, which I'll mention for completeness, but I'm not going to talk about a lot today, is work in progress. So the other kind of key value stream metric is how much work you're trying to get done at once. And these three things are all very much interlinked. You can think of an organization as being made up of value streams. So you have, like an enterprise will have many, many value streams. A startup will generally just have one to start with and break out more value streams along the way. You know, you can think of this in terms of like products and things like that as well. But generally, businesses generate value by getting work done through value streams. And where the industry has been going, and I'll maybe not make comments about where Australia is, but the way the industry is going globally has been moving over to product teams, where a team owns their value stream end to end. Everything is in their sphere of control. They don't get blocked on other teams. And this is like the most effective way of delivering customer value that we've found. It's, you know, kind of there's more to it than this to make it effective, but that's kind of the basis. And if you want to go read kind of more about value streams and product-centric organizations, the Marty Kagan series is really good. Admittedly, I haven't read Transformed yet because that's only came out about 2 months ago, but these are kind of like the seminal texts in the space. This is all great, but security isn't a product team. It can't be, it isn't. Security teams, like the streams of work that security teams do, feed into product streams. So realistically, this is where I come back to that point of you're trying to influence other teams. Generally, security, you're there to kind of set work up for product teams. They'll execute it, and then you kind of verify that things have been done. But bearing that this is the model, this is a lot more complicated to reason about and simulate and figure out what's going on than just when you have these product teams. Because now you've got inter-team dependencies here, and everything just gets a bit more complicated. But there are things we can do. All right, on to the second bit. Becoming constraint aware. So when I say constraint here, I'm very much coming from Eli Goldratt theory of constraints with this. In any system, there's exactly one constraint. There can be many bottlenecks, but there's exactly one constraint. And I say that far too much on a daily basis, but that's what I mean. And the constraint on any value stream is the thing that is controlling the throughput in here. So there's one thing, one step in your value stream, which is going, this is dictating how much stuff I can get done over unit time. And the kind of interesting part that comes off of this is investing away from the constraint is pure waste. So the classic example that comes up when I go to businesses is generally their testing is their slowest part of their value stream. And you can add more developers, but it doesn't actually help because if they're not contributing to the testing constraint, they're actually going to make things worse, not better. This is a classically problems where people misunderstand where the constraint is, and you put stuff in the wrong places. And this this next jab annoys my dad because he has been a project manager for many years. But adding more project managers to a project never makes it go quicker, because project managers are inherently never actually acting on the constraint in here. So you know, adding more project managers to a project just adds to the micromanagement and makes everything worse. When you actually go into the theory of constraints and what's behind it, you end up with what is like kind of like a scientific method, like a rinse repeat formula for things to do to be able to actually make your system more performant. So there's just 5 steps to it. First, you find the constraint, then you optimize the constraint, then you subordinate to the constraint to effectively make all work, order work by its impact at the constraint. And I'll get visually into what that means. Then you elevate the constraint and then you iterate from there. So you're consistently going through. If you look at like the Toyota production system and lean theory, you'll find this absolutely everywhere. And it does have applicability to knowledge work and software as well, which is cool. Constraints. So we want to keep the constraint optimally fed. You never want to starve the constraint because that is lost throughput you can never get back. And you don't want to overload the constraint because that context switching actually starts to become a problem. Multitasking, despite what my wife says when we talk about it, but it is a myth. She reckons she can do it and gets annoyed when I can't, but the research is on my side with this one. Task switching and debating priorities are both wasteful activities. And realistically, we want to release work as the constraint becomes available. So rather than slamming all the work we can into a value stream, we want to be kind of releasing work so it arrives at the constraint just when the constraint is finished with its last bit. Now, bringing this back round into the security sphere, the constraint is outside the security team, like in almost all scenarios in here. So this is where I come back to a security team working harder doesn't actually help anything in here. It's more about this influence. So work enters the sphere of influence in here. So given this is the model that we're working within, we need to know how to understand this and optimize it. And what I'm going to talk about next comes from the Tame flow literature, which I think is a criminally underread kind of part of agile and knowledge work management and all that kind of stuff. I put the 3 kind of cool books on here in the order you should read them. So definitely go for Standing on Bits first, because that's about 100 pages. Then you end up with 400, then you end up with 600. So Standing on Bits first, and then work your way backwards from there. So to make this a little bit more real, if we talk about an infrastructure configuration change here, so say your AWS S3 bucket, you need to change how it's encrypted or something like that, or, even if it's something trivial, it can be something complicated. But effectively, when you look at, okay, well, the security team, you want to get all your product teams, and I've just gone for 3 for simplicity here, you need to get them all to go and change their S3 buckets. And you need to go and figure out what you want them to change it to. So that takes a week. You can then feed it into all the 3 teams, which have differing lead times in there. And then you have a week lead time, and just kind of verify that, our CSPM has said that things are, cleaned up. So if we model it in here, so say there's, a bunch of different infrastructure changes you want to make, and they apply to all teams. That's what the color's there to try and signify, which will become more important in a bit. If we start to play this forward week by week, we can kind of see the work piling up in here. And after 5 weeks, we've got kind of a variety of work backing up in front of other teams. And this is where we start to talk about where the constraints are in here. So when you start to do this kind of modeling with work, you get to the point of the constraint is the longest backlog of work sitting in front of a team measured in time, not necessarily tickets here. So product team 3 is the constraint here because they have 8 weeks of work ahead of them. Even though security team 3 has more work sitting in front of them, that's only 4 weeks worth of work there. So in here, the product team 3 is the constraint. Okay, well, what can we do about this? So we found the team with the longest queue in time. What can we do here? So one of the things we can actually do is we can reshape the work coming through, knowing where the constraint is given the work that we were looking at before. So in here, you'll see that the colors for the product teams have changed slightly. So instead, we've changed the work that's being done based on what teams need to actually action things here. So if we start playing this through again week after week, the work starts flowing through. And after 5 weeks, even just visually, this looks better than where we're at before, right? This is where we're at before, and this is where we are now. This just looks better. But when we actually look at the numbers here in terms of the amount of throughput we got out of the system, if we play it forward to 12 weeks to make the numbers a little bit more stark in here, when you're operating this like constraint naive approach where you're just flinging work all the teams and you're just kind of pumping it through without thinking about it, you end up with 3 things. You've done 3 things and your average lead time is 4 weeks. If you're operating in a constraint-aware fashion, you got the same 3 things done, but you also got another 4 things done, and your average lead time for every piece of work is actually 1.7 weeks in here. So you've more than doubled the throughput of the system, but no one worked harder to make any of this happen. All we did was shape the work around the constraint. You haven't really changed, and they've changed what work you're doing based on the constraint here, but no one's having to work any harder. You're not having to actually change how the teams are working. You're just being smart about how you're actually feeding the work into the system. And this really is working smarter, not harder. So security in an agile world is an interesting point, but I'll dive into it a little bit more now. So agile planning is professional fortune telling. I think we should all be in pretty much agreement with that. What you will find a lot of the time is there's different prioritization mechanisms. Very common one because of SAFe. Not going to bash SAFe. If you want to hear me bash SAFe, just go look at any other talk I've ever done. But they have this idea of weighted shortest job first, which is this idea of cost of delay over size. So, which effectively translated as value over effort. And effectively, if you find the most valuable thing divided by the effort, like the sum of that gives you a prioritization order in here. Where it falls apart, it, conceptually it makes sense, but where it really falls apart is in multi-team scenarios. Because when we talk about job size, what do we actually mean here? Is it the amount of work that every team has to do? Well, no, it's not. We talked about theory of constraints and operating constraint aware. Job size is something very different in here. So, like, if we talk about constraint aware, constraint unaware, with the work we're feeding in, if we change the size of the work, not really. In terms of what the teams are doing, we haven't really changed the size of the work at all. We've just changed how it's flowing through the system. So when we're talking about this, and this is something that all scaled agile fails to take into account, is effort is impact at the constraint in here. So measuring job size is about finding where your constraint is in your system, going, what's the impact of the work at the constraint? That's what I should be dividing job size by, value by, to get that number out. And in the literature, in the Tameful literature, you'll find this talked about as throughput accounting, which has like a very storied history outside of software development. But it's starting to get to the point we start to bring it in. So the constraint is outside the team with security work, and this kind of is the problem where we have roadmaps that look great, but they're not based on anything in reality, because we're just thinking about, well, what can we do? And it's like, well, that's not the point. Is what does the system and the network of teams allow you to do? And you should be basing stuff around that. So you maximize value by shaping the work to the system. So in the previous example, the constraint ended up being the team with the longest lead time. And I just want to be clear here that it's not necessarily the longest lead time. It's the work shape by the lead times that dictates the constraint here. So on like kind of the work I've got on the left, the constraint on actually getting all this done is product team 2. They're the fastest team, but they just have the most work to do, so they become the constraint. What about story points? Because I've been talking a lot about lead time here, but generally people use story points for better or mostly for worse. So if we start to try and apply the same logic and the same look at the world via story points, it gets a little bit, well, it gets a lot worse. So you can have like, average velocity is a thing. If you then go like, well, actually one team does 4 weekly sprints, everyone does 2. Okay, well, we can start to maybe do something with this, but can we really? When you actually look at teams, you look at what Scrum suggests and that kind of stuff, and you should get an ideal burn down that looks something like this. And I've given this talk in public, I always get hands up for anyone's burn down actually look like this. No one said yes as of yet. And if you do have burn downs like this, I'd love to talk to you and actually figure out how you do it. But realistically, burn downs in Scrum and Sprint kind of look like this, where the work kind of piles and there's a mad rush at the end. And this makes things really inherently unpredictable. And what we want is predictable delivery to base the system around. So chasing predictability in here, how do we get it so when we're trying to play work through, we're basing it off high levels of confidence that we can actually trust in what we're looking at, as opposed to other problems in here. So you need a stable system. What do I mean by stable? So the contrived example I gave you before was inherently stable in here. So all the lead times are expressed as kind of set numbers here. Whereas realistically, a lot of the time, it looks more like this, and teams are more unstable in here. So you'll get very kind of high variance in lead times, like 2 to 5 weeks, 1 to 3, 3 to 9. If these are your lead times for work, it starts to get very hard to look at. Now, I'll reference some books in a second about how you can attack this problem. But effectively, even as a security team, attacking this problem is so inherently valuable, even though it's got, realistically, very little to do with security. It's away from the skills you generally have, but it's a really key skill to be actually able to do security at scale. In Agile, there are these, and Jira has these, which is why I like talking about these, because they're just kind of ubiquitous, although people don't look at them. So these are cumulative flow diagrams, and these show kind of the work entering the system per stage. So in that value stream, or like your columns on your Kanban board or whatever, this shows the amount of work in there all the time. And what we want is more like the bottom right, not the top left. And to make it a little bit more explicit, if I add the lines, you can see in the bottom right that the lines are parallel and things are consistent. top left, you can see the lines are diverging, which effectively means that more work is entering the system than we can do, which just leads to all kinds of issues around predictability and everything else. This is kind of, the idea that it gets harder and slower to add shit over time. Kind of this is a way of visually seeing that actually happening in practice. If you go into Jira and go look at like one of your team's cumulative flow diagrams, it looks like the top left. Daniel Vacanti's books are probably the best place to actually go and look at that. You'll notice if you go read those books, those screenshots are from his books. But effectively, there are methods in here, and you will not find these methods in kind of the main scaled agile literature for reasons. So there's kind of the metrics to figure out that things are problematic. With all that talk about value streams, you can do value stream mapping exercises. We actually break down each individual step. That can start to give you points at where your constraint is within your value stream. And then you can apply these are for the product teams, you can apply, like, even though the practice and continuous delivery will generally give you guidelines of where to go to actually go and start attacking the constraint in your value stream and constantly kind of get it faster and faster and more just predictable. So you get to that point of your lead time is stable, not unstable. So protecting capacity for security. This is kind of like the last little bit here. So say you've got teams that are stable, and one of the things is their process, the way teams do work, is inherently unstable. But even in cases where you have, like, what we do weekly, we do fortnightly scrums, so we release every 2 weeks, even though that's not great, but it is what it is. And you can get like a stability of work coming through because stuff gets released every 2 weeks. But there's kind of more under this, unfortunately, for security stuff. So security work gets constantly deprioritized. I'm probably getting some twitches from the audience in this because we all know this is the reality in the vast majority of organizations. I'm going to hopefully give you what I found to be the most effective thing to kind of work as a catalyst to get away from that. And that's flow distribution, which comes from Mick Kirstland's book, Project to Product. And I'm just diving into one very deep section here as opposed to taking through the whole thing, but effectively the flow distribution says that all work can be split into one of 4 different buckets in here. So feature, risk, defect, and debt. And the really interesting part about this is effectively they all come from different places. So product gives you features, customer support gives you defects, the team looks after debt, and risk comes from security. So if we have these 4 buckets, we can start to do something with it. And, realistically, this is paraphrasing a Tim Ferriss quote, but is there a decision I can make here that prevents the next 100 decisions in here? And effectively, what I like to call benevolent dictatorship prioritization. The fact that these 4 buckets are all owned by a kind of singular person or team is incredibly powerful and kind of like a missed piece of the puzzle in here. So features are product owners, risk is security, defects customers, and debt comes from the team. The problem with a lot of this stuff is there's a human tendency for hyperbolic discounting, which is a fancy way of saying short-term gain for long-term pain. So given this is kind of a natural bias in humans, we have to figure out, okay, well, what do we do instead then? If we're going to naturally tend for short-term gain over long-term pain, what can we put in as a system to counteract this? And effectively, you actually go, well, risk and debt both have a set percentage of allocation, whether this is every sprint or if you're working more in a pull Kanban style, 20% of tickets measuring over a period of time are risk and 20% of debt. Now, 20% is just a good number that I quite like, but generally if you go and negotiate this, you'll never stick with 20, you'll get kind of bartered down from there, but that's fine. This is kind of an instance of anchoring from never split the difference. So you start high with the intention you'll meet in the middle and you'll be happy. And the critical part here is that these 2 are filled up first. So before you get feature factory and the feature bucket is overflowing and there's no room for anything else, you actually go, well, we actually need to weed the garden. So we're going to do risk and debt first, and we'll use leftover capacity for feature and defect. The important thing about these buckets is they use it or lose it. So as security, if you're not filling these risk buckets up for teams, they'll take that spare kind of allocation and assign it into features and defects. That's perfectly fine and kind of how it works. So the teams that are on top of their risk and security will then go get the capacity back to go chase after features. more features again, and that kind of stuff. So if you've gone down this path of the teams are going down their release processes and the way they work is inherently stable, and we've gone and got it so security work actually gets treated as a first-class citizen, then you can actually get to this point of stability here, which is a really interesting point for, well, actually now we have a stable system we can plan and project around with confidence, as opposed to kind of just throwing stuff at the wall and seeing what sticks. So where are we now? We've maximized the system we have. So we haven't actually got we haven't changed how teams are, necessarily doing all that much delivery. We've kind of just given the system we've got, what are we doing in here? So if we come back to the 5 focusing steps from before, we've found the constraint, we've optimized the constraint, we've subordinated the constraint, and then we're talking about elevating the constraint here. So what can we do as a security team to elevate the constraint? What can we do that doesn't necessarily have to get us to make every other team go and make changes? So there's kind of 3 general options in here. Shift left, talk to death, not going to talk about it today. Push down, which comes from the platform engineering school, is an interesting one, but I'm going to dive into moving empowerment around because I think this is kind of the lesser known and far more interesting one. So last kind of tidbit to kind of finish off, Google's large-scale change approach, which they talk about in the book that I'll reference right at the end. So they've actually gone, well, okay, this multi-value stream stuff is cool, but can we actually just get rid of it? Can we get it so security can actually do stuff without having to deal with all these multiple value streams? So what they've done is they've said it so the accountability for service belongs to a product team, but they've given empowerment to security teams to make changes autonomously in here. So Log4j was an interesting one where in the nature of the way Google work, they have a giant monorepo where everything is. Every dependency is only there in one instance for the entire repo. So updating Log4j at Google was a single change of a dependency, which then percolated up through the entire stack. And even though security could go and make this change and upgrade like a Log4j version or something, or take any kind of example, XZ is the current, hotness of kind of the problems in security, but this is kind of, security can go and do this independently, but if any system broke, that was a problem of the product team or SRE for not building enough kind of checks and balances into their release process to find that there was a problem and stop the change percolating all the way to production. The problem with this is you require world-leading development operations, which you can move towards, but this kind of empowering security teams to make change autonomously requires a level of technical capability that a lot of enterprises don't have yet. So it becomes a problem, but it's kind of interesting to see if you project all the way past kind of into exactly what the best option is that you could potentially have. It's actually this, where you're actually empowering security teams to make changes and you don't have to talk to people about you making the change because they should have automated everything to the point where stuff will get caught along the way. So just to sum up, again, understanding how work flows is fundamental. You need to be constraint aware, and Agile doesn't scale across teams, but this approach of theory of constraints does scale. It doesn't matter kind of the scale, it goes with you the whole way. So I know I referenced, I think about 10 books, give or take, but if you just go and pick up 3, Standing on Bits, Project to Product, and Software Engineering at Google are probably the kind of 3 most impactful ones. Unless you had a specific burning need to go and read one of the other ones I referenced. And that's me done.
That was fantastic, Josh. I know that a number of people are very keen if you have a full reading list from the presentation to post that somewhere. I also see that Matt, who is sitting in the corner, who's off stream at the moment, was taking notes and furiously writing away. So I think there was a lot of people who were really interested in what you're talking about, and it's always interesting to see the linkage between the security aspects and the dev side. Like, I don't think we put enough aspect on like the dev processes and how we fit within those dev processes.
Yeah, I think. Well, I still call myself a software engineer, even though I'm a published security author. I still count myself as a soft eng / dirty management consultant. So. I came into security because I got annoyed and was like, I need to figure out how to do that side as well. and try and bring that angle. So hopefully it's a bit different. And I'll jump into Discord quickly. I have to go wrangle my 2-year-old off my wife in a minute, but I'll be dropping out of Discord.
Just very quickly, if I can ask a question, what genre would a band called Hyperbolic Discounting play?
I don't know, thrash metal maybe.
Somebody did say thrash.
Scandinavian death metal. I don't know.
Yeah. There's a lot of ideas about that. Look, thank you very much, Josh. I won't keep you longer. Your presentations are all amazing, so thank you again.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me.
No worries.